Here we have an image shot with a Canon R5 mirrorless camera, along with a Canon RF 100 to 500mm lens, and the lens is set at the 500mm focal length. The sophisticated image stabilization of the Canon R5 with the lens was turned off because I needed an f/32 aperture with 100 ISO to enable me to take the shutter speed right down to 1/20th of a second. The idea, of course, was to pan with the subject to create movement that affects practically every part of the image. Here's the original raw image opened up in the Develop module of Lightroom. My first task is global editing. This is the editing that first affects the entire image. Now I want to start with quite a severe crop and maybe even a little rotation too. So selecting the crop tool here, what I'd like to do is to create this image for a slideshow. So I'm looking to create a 16:9 aspect ratio. If we go to the As Shot option on the right hand side, we can see we do have a 16:9 aspect ratio, but I don't want those pixel values. I want to retain them all at the moment. So I'm going to go down to enter a custom value. So I'm going to put 16 in there and 9 in there and click OK. There, now we can see the 16:9 aspect ratio. So let's decide on the crop. And what we're looking for here is impact and appeal, good composition. There you can see what I mean about rotating the image. Because we're so close, I can, I think, standardize on something like that. Now you can see there from the rule of thirds that I've got strong compositional points here, somewhat down here, the bald pointing to the one on the left hand side, and of course a nice diagonal of the surfboard as well. So down to the bottom right of the screen, I'm going to click Done. That's the image we're going to be working forward with. Now I've cropped in extremely tight on this image, but the image is blurred. So our normal concerns about doing this are not quite such an issue. However, let's take a look at the effect that this tight crop has on the noise in the image. I'm going to go up to the top left and I'm going to click once to bring the picture up, and we can see a little bit of noise here. So over on the right hand side into the detail section, I'm going to push my noise reduction somewhere up to about 30-35. That doesn't look too bad. I can still see some noise here, but it's smoothed out considerably. So bringing the image back onto the screen, let's close the Detail tab and open up the Basic tab to begin the rest of the global editing. Now to do that, I'm going to turn to the Auto button and give it a click. You'll see all the sliders move slightly. I'm going to use this as my starting point. Now the first thing I'm going to look up at is the histogram at the top of the screen, because I'm going to look at maybe moving the whites and the black slider to increase the contrast just a little bit. But I'm going to be looking for the guides up at the top right. You'll see them light up. See the little yellow triangle? So we want to make sure we don't go past the point where we're losing detail. But even moving that whites a little bit to the right, you can see we get quite light areas here and here. So I'm going to live with that. I'm going to do the same with the blacks. I don't have quite so far to go with the blacks. And of course that's a little bit more forgiving than the whites, but I'll come back from that highlight at the top left of that histogram, just a little bit. So I'm making the most of the contrast. I'll take a little bit of clarity as well. Maybe I'll adjust that exposure a little bit, maybe just up a little bit. And maybe a bit more vibrance as well. The image was shot just a few minutes before sunset. There's not a great deal more I can do with the global editing, but I would like to deal with a couple of issues. First of all, while looking closely at this image, I can see a little dust spot there and one there. So I think that needs to be my next port of call. This is the option we want. Let's select that. I've got my feather selected to 0. I don't need that. The opacity is up full. The size, well, let's drop the size down to be quite small, a little bit bigger than that. Using the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P there, I'm just going to click over that one and that one, looking around carefully to see if there's any others. There may be one or two, and if I spot them later, I'll deal with them. Now I want to deal with this highlight here. It's just a bit lighter than the rest, a little bit here and here. To do that, I'm going to turn to my masks. So over to the mask icon on the right hand side. And the mask that I want to use first is the brush. You can see it has a shortcut key of K, which can be quite useful. So when I select the brush, there you can see the size of the brush. The outer ring is where it's going to be soft. The next ring in is where the brush is going to be quite hard. So what I'm interested in here is maybe going over to the settings for this brush. I know I want to drop down the highlights and I want to drop down the exposure. I want to keep the flow of this particular tool quite low, something about there to start with, and I can adjust the size of the brush using those square bracket keys to the right of the letter P. So once I've got it down to the size I think is appropriate, I just want to wipe gently over these areas. Now you can see I've got that setting just about right because it's taking away the highlights that I want to remove. You soon get a feel for the changes you need to make here before you even use the brush or the mask in question. But now I can continue and I can do the others. Sometimes the brush needs to be a bit bigger, and down at the bottom right. And as we go down to the bottom corner, maybe I can make use of the brush by darkening the corner and even moving over to the bottom left corner where I've got a little bit of a distraction there and along the bottom. So I'm making my brush do multiple jobs here. But it has dealt with the main 3 areas I wanted to deal with. Now I think my surfer could do with darkening on the right hand side because we do have quite a dark area on the left and light on the right. To do that, I'm going to go back to my masks, create a new mask, and here I'm going to select the linear gradient. On here I can click and drag. There I can see my gradient. I don't need to come in too far, but if I needed to come in quite a distance, you can see I'm going to start to encroach now on my surfer. So in these scenarios, what we can often do is go back to the mask, click these 3 little dots, and we can intersect, if I can say that properly, intersect the mask with another one of the tools. And here I'm going to select subject. Now, as we see this working away, quite often it'll give us an odd effect. It's not working that well here, mainly I think because of the blur, but it's having some effect. So let's take a look at the effect by just picking up the exposure and dropping it down. So you can see what I'm looking to do here is to really hold in the right hand side. So it is having a little bit of an effect on the surfer there. But of course, if it was really desperate that I shouldn't be doing that, then of course I can always just click the subtract, maybe use a brush, and I could use the brush to remove any of the overspill onto my surfer. So with these masks, we really have our cake and we can eat it too. We have the best of all worlds. Now, the bottom left corner looks a little weak to me, so I'm going to deal with that. I'm going to go for another graduated filter or graduated mask. So back to create new mask, linear gradient, M is the shortcut key. Click and drag. You can see the area I want to deal with. Once I've got it in place, I'm going to do what I did before. I'll drop the exposure a little bit. It's a bit blue there, so maybe I can warm that a bit by going up to the temperature and just taking away some of that blue So it just matches in better with the water down there. Maybe a little bit of blacks to the left, a little bit of whites to the right, add a little bit of sparkle. So I'm getting an increase in contrast and I'm getting that corner darkened all at the same time. Do I want a little bit more on the base of the image? Well, I think that's going to be a personal choice. Let's take a look at the left-hand side in relation to the water here. It's a green sheet of water. So here I'm going to touch the M key. Now the M key is the shortcut for the gradient mask. So I'm going to click and drag over here. Now you can see the area I want to affect. What do I want to do here? Well, maybe I'd like to lift the shadows a bit so I can get a little bit more colour into that water. Maybe a little bit of an exposure. But of course, in doing that, I've lightened the base down here. So once again, if that wasn't something I wanted to achieve, then let's go back to the subtract, choose a brush, keep that flow rate quite low, a nice big brush, and I can remove any of the lightening down there by just brushing over that. And sometimes you may need to go back to the flow and increase or decrease it if it's working a little bit too slow for you. But I get the option to do something with the top left with that filter, but I don't have it impact the bottom left, which I don't want. I think I could do with another gradient right at the top, really hold that top in. So once again, let's touch the M key and click, drag it down. Let's take a look at dropping the highlights, the exposure. Let's move this out of the way. That's not looking too bad. A little bit of a weakness here. So why don't we add another one? Touch the M key again. Let's deal with this. Drop down the exposure there. Maybe I can even take away some of that blue a little bit. Bit of blacks, bit of whites, all personal choice, these things. But I think we're getting somewhere. Let's put this back up and take a look. What I'd like to do next is to see if I can lift the skin tones or the colour of the surfer's skin, because I think they would go quite well with the cooler colours around. So maybe we can turn to a brush mask here. K is the shortcut key. So what we can do here is drop down the size of the brush. I can step up the saturation quite considerably. I've got my flow rate up to around 36. So I'm looking to just increase the colour here, and if it's not enough, then I'll push it up even a little more. A little bit down there and on the legs. A little bit around the back, and maybe even we'll raise the colour in the shorts as well. And all we're doing here is to trying to just lift the appeal of the surfer. I dragged the thing around then. Did you see me move that around? That was a mistake. If you do that, just hit Ctrl Z and it'll be reset. So that looks pretty good. Maybe I've gone a little bit over the top, but of course we do have the opportunity to just drop back the saturation slider to get as much or as little as we need. Now I could even try to use the same brush if I wanted to increase the greens. Just bring up a little bit more colour here and down this area, then maybe we could consider that also. But I'm not sure we need to do much else. Let's click Done and take a look. Now after looking at the image for a short while, I think there's just a couple of touches I'd like to make here. I'm going to click to bring the picture up in size. There's a few highlights that I think I'd like to deal with, so I'm going to select my spot removal. Again, same settings as before. I'll drop the size of the brush down considerably and we'll deal with these a little bit at a time. So that bit first, maybe this bit next. Ooh, doesn't want to let go of my pen. I'll hit Ctrl Z there to undo that. That was a little bit of a mistake. I'm using a graphics tablet and when I lifted off the surface it didn't want to break the connection for some reason. That's quite unusual. But there you can see those are done. What I'd like to do is one or two of these here, not a great number of them, just the worst of these, the ones that show up at normal size. So I'll click a couple of these and we'll deal with them. But from time to time with this sort of work, I feel it's quite useful to just reset the image back to its normal size and determine exactly which one of these little spots still are visible, because most of these are part and parcel of the movement of the image. Now I've zoomed into this image 2 or 3 times and done one or two of the little highlights that I thought were intrusive, then clicked done and looked at the image at this size, because at the end of the day it's really a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? How many of them do we want to do really is in relation to the success of the image as we see it. But I think I'm more or less done. As always with any image processing, there's going to be some aspects that can be right or wrong, but there's also many aspects that contain just personal choice. The most obvious of these is the colour saturation and colour balance, but there's going to be others too. Now the processing of this image really contained few difficulties at all, and it's fairly typical of my workflow these days. Now I say these days because the introduction of masks into Lightroom in 2022 has changed the way I work. Image editing evolves, but our aim is always much the same. And that's producing interesting, well-processed images, hopefully with impact. Now let me know in the comments if this style of start-to-finish video is something that appeals to you, and also consider subscribing to my channel and hitting the thumbs up. It's nice to know if you're on the right track. But for now, I'll see you next time.